The discussion is filled with angst about incoming migrants taking up space, jobs, benefits, but our countries desperately need these incoming people to sustain these systems in the first place. Yes, we do have a hard time with migration and integration in European countries, and denying it would just worsen matters. But why don't we try to talk about it a bit more in depth and with an interested ear? Why are we having parallel societies in the same city? What's happening with second-generation migrants? Why are they having so much trouble feeling like they belong? I have 3 colleagues with me today to yammer all about it. Merve Akyel is the art director of Eurozine, a native of Istanbul who has lived in Vienna for 12 years. In her own art practice, she deals with gender-based violence as well as shame and guilt. Ioana Pelehatăi is the senior editor of the Bucharest-based online magazine Scena No, publishing both in Romanian and in English. Most of her recent work has focused on the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, while previously she covered human rights issues such as anti-Roma racism and LGBTQIA+ rights. Daniela Univazo is a filmmaker with South American roots who was born and raised in Vienna. She is the head writer of the Standard Time talk show and is currently writing for international filmmakers. Very welcome, colleagues. Now I get the privilege of talking with colleagues only. Let's start with you, Ioana, because I think in a sense you are in a very, very peculiar situation in Romania. So please tell us about how Romania is both a recipient and a quote-unquote sender country in this weird helix.
The thing with Romania is that we have, on the one hand, the 5th largest diaspora in the world, and at the same time, we have the lowest percentage in the EU of non-citizen residents. So that's just 1.1%. As in many other parts of the world, sadly, this year, quite a lot of anti-foreigner rhetoric has made its way in public discourse. As in many other places in Europe and the world at large, the far right is trying to angle its way onto the political scene, and they're also succeeding. And at the same time, we've been seeing quite a big influx of economic migrants in Romania over the past 2 years, let's say. A lot of Southeast Asians and Africans are now working in delivery, in kitchens, in cleaning, and so on. This is all slightly ironic since, we have millions and millions of Romanians living and working in the United Kingdom, in Spain, in Germany, in France, in Austria, and they have seen similar struggles. So to me, I think it's very peculiar that we as a nation are not showing more empathy.
So I am very strongly reminded of a wedding where I emceed, and at some point the guy who was officiating the wedding gave this very long, very weird speech, and at some point says, because love is not only when the man is defending the woman with his own body when the migrants are coming. And these were bursting with laughter because they're Eastern European migrants to Bristol in a country which had just voted for Brexit out of hatred for these people. So how misplaced can that be? A huge portion of the population has first-hand or second-hand migration experience.
The far-right political discourse is, based on disseminating and instilling fear of the unknown. He or she or they who do not look like us, they have a different color skin, a different faith, a different cultural background, you name it. I think it's quite easy to find that there are more things that unite us than those that divide us. I think that's one of the key takeaways of our editorial project. It's so much better for everyone involved and for the country's economy to look at common grounds and similarities rather than distinctions.
I think we can sort of harken back to a distinction from just a couple years ago when this was very popular to differentiate between migrants and expats. And I honestly think that this is a sort of artificial class distinction in there. Daniela, you have a very close experience
of these different backgrounds.
Yeah, my dad comes from Peru and my mom comes from Colombia. And of course, Colombia in the 80s was a different kind of thing, especially for my grandfather, because he cannot shut up, even though society powers or the government will tell him to shut up. And he was defending the farmers without rights. And and then he was persecuted by the government, and he said, I'm getting out of here, I'm gonna take care of my family. He took my mom and my uncle, and then they went to Spain, and then in Spain they said, we're not taking any Latinos, and then they were like, okay, are you going to Sweden, or you can go to Austria? And my grandfather was reading a book of Stefan Zweig, and he was like, let's try Austria, I like this book, it sounds good. And and then they really started out in refugee camps, which is really, really a really hard place to be in. And my mom was 16, and the one thing that really helped her to really integrate into society was learning the language. And the interesting thing, my dad, who came with a lot of privilege, was in this bubble of international people, human rights, and he never bothered to learn the language actually until he was 60 years old. And Austria doesn't make it easy to integrate. It's not an easy, welcoming place to be in.
Now, if you like what you see and if you manage to make you laugh at least once, please support our work at patreon.com/Eurozine, that is the magazine presenting this show. You can pledge as little as €5 a month or whatever you can afford, and you'll get access to bonus materials, early access, and even get to suggest topics and questions. Now back to the program.
Merve, you got the comment that you have an Austrian Aussage, an Austrian pronunciation, which is both a compliment and an interesting place to be. But you oftentimes remind me that you don't consider yourself European to some extent because you were raised on the Asian side of Istanbul, which is, it's always a contestable place. How has your immigration experience been so far?
My position is very privileged because I came here not by force. I moved to Austria I moved to Austria by choice. I first came as a student, not as an expat. I kind of understand what you mean with this international bubble. All the friends, all the colleagues that I had at the academy, they were from mostly Scandinavian countries, and the drill, or a few from Netherlands and so on, or Germany. When we were all together, we were really living outside the bubble. However, to finance my studies a bit, and I was working outside, what I was studying, I was doing a lot of side jobs, so to say. The reality that I was facing there was much more different, and the people that I ran had different opinions on me as well. What I realized in Austria the most is there is this sort of very deeply rooted racism towards migrants, as I would say certain migrants, not all of them. And I think this will resonate with a lot of people. I mean, I am very much aware of the way I look. I am white, I'm European, even though I don't feel one, but I have been subject to microaggression unfortunately, from a lot of Austrian citizens. One of them, I recently talked to my husband, who is, by the way, half Taiwanese, half Austrian, so there's a lot going on there as well. Well, I told him, because we were talking about cows and stuff in Switzerland, there was a colleague of mine who I considered a very close friend, and unfortunately this person wasn't joking, and this person looked at me straight in the eye once and told me, oh, but your mother knows how to take care of cows, right? I'm like, I mean, it's a great thing, I wish she did, but she doesn't. I'm like, why? And she's like, oh, I think in Turkey you do that. And I'm like, it's not even a bad thing, but where does this come from? And I then asked this person, how do you know about this? How many Turkish people besides me you met in your life? Everybody had a school friend from, Turkey. Oh, his mother had cows in the village. He's from a village. I'm from Istanbul. Still saying, because I cannot stress this enough, I'm very well aware these are small details, But some part of me also thinks that I started internalizing this and thinking that these are okay, you know.
The thing is, it definitely has to do with this very specific situation of Turkish guest workers in Austria and Germany who arrived by the thousands, invited by the states throughout the 70s and 80s when there was crippling labor shortage. And there were policies in place in West Germany for sure that they were supposed to leave for the summer. So they were expected to definitely not stay. But can you tell us about the situation in Romania with outmigration? There's literally the better part of generations who have left the country since you joined the EU.
The millions who have left, have obviously left because, like most countries in the region, following the 1989 revolution in Romania, there was of bad faith privatization of formerly state-owned factories and all sorts of companies. Entire towns were depopulated because of this, because there was literally nowhere to work. So many, in the desire to build a better life for themselves and for their children, left in droves. There are several phenomena here, often middle-aged Romanian women who go to Italy to take care of Italian elders there. And there's this entire psychological phenomenon surrounding them. Many of them are captive there. They're kept in very poor conditions. They're not allowed to socialize with other migrants, or basically sometimes not even allowed to leave the house. Moldova, our eastern neighbor, has seen a similar phenomenon as well. Children growing up in both countries, and I'm sure we are not the only ones, being raised by an aunt or a grandfather or a grandmother, seeing their mothers mostly in video calls, receiving beautiful presents at Christmas or on their birthdays that, you know, their mother would not afford in Romania. But the question that we as a society need to ask ourselves, and we needed to ask this of ourselves yesterday, is how will this affect these children growing up essentially motherless and often parentless? Many of these children are now in their 20s. They're starting families of their own. They're wondering if they should go abroad and follow with their children, but then who's gonna be left here, you know?
In Turkey, this is also very common as well. We have a lot of people coming from mostly women, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. And my grandmother is also luckily taken care of by the most we're very grateful to her. Obviously, our working relationship is not like this, but I heard stories from her. There are agencies who arrange this travel and then they take their passports. And you know why? Because they are scared they will run away if the job gets too hard. Who can you go to? And she's like, who can I go to? You know, they will deport me. And I'm like, what will happen? And she's like, I have a sick child at home, which she hasn't seen for more than 7 years. And then she's saying, you know, like, this is my reality. Like, this is how I live and this is how I learn to live. Yeah, and so this is really, especially this caretaking situation is a very harsh reality, I think, in Turkey as well.
In Europe and Northern America, there is a suffocating shortage of healthcare workers and care workers in general, including pedagogues. It's because these systems are underpaid, so the locals oftentimes cannot afford or do not want to work for the local wages. So there's this vacuum of being under-resourced. It's very easy. Put that money back into the system, and then people can afford to stay where their families are, where they want to live their lives, and then migration can be a choice if they want to and not a force.
In this Life Stories Not Numbers, editorial project, we covered the story of Jawal. He is a young doctor hailing from India who studied in Saudi Arabia, but eventually wound up in Romania. He now has to redo his medical studies, which he's paying for out of pocket because that's what the Romanian state thinks foreign students should do. But even when he finishes his studies, and this guy also volunteers, he helps NGOs that works with children. He's like a super stand-up guy, and he's like, I would like to work in Romania after I finish my studies, but the law that will not allow him. So we have this exact situation here with doctors leaving in droves for France or the UK or Germany. And this guy, if he wants to stay here and work here, he either needs to work for a year in an entirely different field, don't ask me why, or get married to a Romanian, which, you know, maybe he doesn't want to, I don't know. An outstanding example of how much our state, at least, does not care and does not want these professionals that we so desperately need.
Ultimately, I think there are very clear driving factors why people leave countries and leave for countries. And I find it quite peculiar that we somehow talk about these attitudes on a large scale and always come back to ultimately racism and xenophobia as some kind of a natural necessity, right? And I say this as somebody who hasn't really had bad experiences, and I do get the most privileged treatment through the immigration system because I happen to be an EU citizen. Most annoyment I face is when everybody feels so sorry for poor Hungarian colleagues, which is, on the one hand, that's the only reason I have some international career. On the other hand, it's just virtue signaling. It doesn't mean anything. But I guess for a Turkish citizen, you get that all the time.
Oh yes, oh yes. Oh, it must be so bad there. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure there are worse places to be, you know. Like they ask me something, but like as if they heard the name and of someone from the politics, and then they look at me and say, what do you think? And then I say a few things because I have some opinions maybe, or sometimes not. I just say I don't have an opinion at the moment. And then they're like, and say some most uninformed random things. Like for me this is always weird. Like I don't, for example, go to an Austrian and ask, I mean there's a lot to ask nowadays, by the way, but you know, why can't you just talk to me about the weather, for example? Like just be normal, you know.
We had this experience recently when we were in Amsterdam last summer, talking between each other, and the pub keeper comes there and asks where we're from. And we said, Hungary. And he said, oh, Mr. Orban, huh? And we were like...
I have the problem with Pablo Escobar. Like, everybody's like, oh, and the cartel and the Cali cartel. When I say I'm gonna go in November, I'm gonna go to Colombia, I'm gonna see some family there. How incredibly cool this series about Pablo Escobar is, and I'm always like, guys, but he actually killed a lot of people, and it's really hard to then talk about him like he's nothing, just having small talk about him. But
I have to introduce you to my previous Kazakh students because they get a much worse name from Borat, who is not even Kazakh. That those poor women, the amount of explaining they have to do, and it's also so offensive. It's supposed to be, the whole Borat universe was supposed to be some kind of a satire of how dumb Americans are. So I think as long as we go for stereotypes, we're going to find very offensive ones. But tell us about your experience growing up Austrian with an immigration, like for second generation immigrant background, because if I think of everything positive in my Austrian stereotypes, and believe me, there's a lot, there's a reason I'm there, you embody all of those. Oh. You are this little Central European ray of sunshine with the work ethic and the perspective and all that. So in an interesting sense, you're also extremely Austrian. How does this picture come together in your person? Well, or is just luck and I should give up trying to adhere to that?
I think that's my mom making me, she's very positive. But the thing is that it's super difficult to be Austrian. I'm even I don't even really consider myself really Austrian. I would say Viennese, and I feel very happy that I can even say this. And I'm super proud of my South American roots. Right now we have, since it is so difficult to enter the Austrian society, we have parallel societies creating. So right now we have little bubbles of parallel societies, and a lot of people, and I myself included, don't think that's a good idea. But I have to say, if you don't know them, like for example in the countryside, the far right is much more stronger in the countryside than it is in the city, and we have much more migrants in the city. We're more socialist in Vienna, for example. And I think that's the beauty of it. If you get to know them, if you start eating the food, if you start listening to their personal stories, like you say, not the numbers, then the fear gets smaller. And that's what gives me a lot of hope.
If you want to know more about why DNA maps are so misleading, check out Daniel Strand's great article on this in the Slovenian journal Sodobnost, which you can also read in English in Eurozine. Link is in the description, along with our other sources, because we don't just invent histories here. You find reading lists with every episode at eurozine.com/standardtime. And now back to the conversation.
Can we talk about Bucharest for a little bit? Romania is quite peculiar within, most of Europe, in that capital cities tend to be extremely different to the rest of the country. But Romania is not that unipolar a country, so Bucharest is not the only sort of big outstanding intellectual hub, although Bucharest is a culturally fascinating and burgeoning metropolis.
Out of the 4 historical regions that make up Romania, Bucharest is sort of stands on its own, but Bucharest is the richest city in Romania, and then it's quite closely followed by Cluj, who's in Transylvania in the west. I think most migrants will end up in one of these. We have had some interesting cases. One of them actually, 2 men from Sri Lanka. So these 2 men wind up in small-time Romania in Transylvania, and there was a riot against them. Like the people of the village were up in arms, going, "We don't want." This was their problem. "We don't want their dark hands to touch our white bread." It doesn't get more symbolic than this. Yeah. Eventually, peace was restored and nothing bad happened to these 2 guys, to my knowledge. But I can see how this inspired a film that's a snapshot of Romanian society and our attitudes towards.
And I wonder whether you also have something similar that has been weaponized in Hungary against the Roma population. My favorite is when they talk about the Roma as if they are migrants. They've been there for 600 goddamn years. I don't understand how this even comes about. Is this also present in Romania?
Oh, so much. The slight change that we are seeing over the past decade, let's say, Roma intellectuals and politically active Roma are starting to show up in, they can no longer talk over them that much as they used to. But yeah, if you're not, in the Roma elite, it's just, like one of the biggest ghettos in Europe is outside of Cluj-Napoca, and it's predominantly Roma. It's crazy to go there. There are people who are literally living next to a garbage dump, because that's where we white Romanians put them, next to the second richest city in Romania, after we enslaved them for 500 years. I mean, come on.
When Ioana says that the Roma population was enslaved in Romania, we are talking literal legal slavery. It's not an exaggeration. It's the institution itself, which was abolished in...
I think it was 1864. Sorry for the interruption.
Yes. No. Thank you. I appreciate that. I have a beef with numbers. Okay, rant over, but let's go to Merve and talk a little bit about Istanbul, probably the most influential cultural center throughout most of Europe's history. So we're talking about a 2,000-year-old city which has this extremely strong position both in culture and politics throughout its entire time.
In my research projects, I'm working directly with art from Turkey. For example, personally, some of the things that I'm saying in my research are not exactly very compatible or would be very compatible back home. Being in Austria allows me to do this. Of course, in Turkey, there is a much more, dynamic conversation going on about this topic than Austria. I keep traveling back and forth. So much of my art practice suffered from this going back and forth, not having a permanent, a ground where I can build connections. That's why a lot of people just choose to go for a time being and then just always either be based in Istanbul while they keep their, like privileges in abroad, so to say.
Legislatures and legal frameworks are not prepared to cope with the fact that people may actually exist in multiple places at the same time. This is a very, very peculiar situation, even within the European Union, which is, who's higher on legislation than the EU? This is our daily dose. The European Union doesn't understand that you may want to have social security in multiple countries. Daniela, your parents' ancestral homelands are way further away than Nyíregyháza from Vienna. Yes. So how does keeping in touch with family and culture and roots work on this distance?
I believe when you have parents from a different place, they kind of create this country in your home. So it's like, I had Colombia at home, I had arepas, I had dancing in the kitchen. I know that's a stereotype, but we actually do it. Then going out and being like, okay, now I'm in Vienna, now I'm living through all these other realities. And I found it interesting combining those two. But to your question of commuting, that's an incredible privilege to say that, but I was 12 times in Peru. I think that's something that you have to work on, because I want to feel like I have my South American roots strongly, and I have my grandparents, and I don't want to feel like I cannot even talk to them, for example, if I wouldn't know how to speak Spanish. And also to see the different realities. Since I'm 8 years old, I was seeing third world realities, and I came back to Vienna being like, we're so privileged.
But I cannot help and press you from your parents. Yeah. They are both native Spanish speakers. Whose accent do you have? Who wins?
In Spanish?
Yeah.
I have a Mexican accent, they tell me.
Really?
Yes, I don't know how.
Does it come about?
I picked it up. I think it was the Disney movies, like, this, were like translated into this Mexican Spanish. That's what they tell me, but I'm a mix of all. I say chévere in Colombian, I say voy a chambear in the Peruvian slang, and so I have a mix of everything.
I really hoped for some cultural clash that you have to admit to here.
No, the only bad thing, I get really into trouble, is when Colombia plays against Peru. That's the only thing I always say super diplomatically, like my Austrian soul says I'm half-time Colombia, half-time Peru.
Hungarian football fans are going to be equally racist towards both.
I think I'm sadly going to circle back to politics and the ascension of the Romanian far right. I think it's interesting to know that the Romanian diaspora is quite a fan of theirs, and the fact that these people and these parties have anti-migration discourse, but at the same time can convince migrants that they are the best solution for them, for me is just, on the one hand, mind-blowing, and on the other hand, something that we need to address as a society. That sort of discourse works for them because many are disenfranchised in the countries that they're living and working in. And so a strong arm leader from their home country is going to look very appealing. But let's hope we can do something about that still.
For me, it is just to say you don't have to be just one thing. Like, you don't have to just identify with one nationality. You can be multiple and be proud of all of them. And that's what I figured out just recently, that you can really be that. Yeah, just to embrace it and be like, yes, I love schnitzel and I also love arepas, and I think both of them were great.
Just a closing remark for my fellow Turkish citizens: you cannot be that both. You can only be a Turkish citizen or Austrian citizen. Don't rush to get your double citizenship. You will really lose the Austrian one.
Just on a symbolic level, because Turkey was playing against Austria. And I saw something beautiful, which was just Turkish citizens or second generation having like both flags on their cheek and being like home plays against home. And I think that's such a yeah, right. And that's such a beautiful symbol of integration, being like, yes, we can actually go there.
I really love how Daniela conjures these images of multiple cultural identities, and Merve's, but remember your immigration status, people.
That was such a problem with the double citizenship. That's why I just wanted to remind our viewers, there
it's a PSA. Don't forget about your immigration status, and be careful what you talk in front of authorities. for the love of God.
Now we want to know, are you having trouble with belonging and identity? Do you live where you were born or have you moved? How far and how often? Also, do you like your neighbors? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're rummaging already down there, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. This talk show is presented by Eurozine, and if you haven't heard of it, you should check it out right now. Because this online magazine trades in the scarcity item, and that's insight. Eurozine publishes thoughtful long-form articles from more than 100 partner journals across dozens of European languages, and you have access to all of it for free. Display Europe is the force behind this project. It is one of the only content sharing platforms that offers you articles, podcasts, and videos about European politics and culture in 15 languages. And yes, they don't even abuse your user data. I know it's unbelievable. Go check it out at displayeurope.eu. This program is co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union and the European Culture Foundation. Importantly, the views and opinions expressed here are those of the speakers and the authors only, and they do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the EACAA can be held responsible for them. Not that we would mind them taking advice from us.